They say freedom in the West was free, as long as you had a horse and a gun. But for a woman in the Wyoming Territory in 1887, freedom cost exactly $50. That was the price on her head. She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a runaway. She was a daughter. Standing on the creaking floorboards of the Dusty Spur Saloon, she watched her own father shake hands with the devil. Or so they called him. Silas Thorne, a man whose silence was louder than a gunshot. She expected a life of hell. She expected to be broken. But what she found behind the gates of his ranch wasn't a prison. It was a truth that would burn down everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the law. This isn't a fairy tale. This is how she survived. The smell of Red Hollow was always the same: stale beer, wet sawdust, and the metallic tang of dried blood. It was a town built on desperation, clinging to the edge of the Laramie Mountains like a tick on a stray dog. She was 18 years old, wearing a dress that had been patched 3 times at the hem, standing in the corner of the saloon while her father, Jeremiah Vance, drank away the last of his dignity. "She's strong," her father slurred, gesturing toward her with a trembling hand. "Cooks, cleans, never talks back. A good breeder too, I reckon, given time." The girl stared at the floor, counting the knots in the wood. If she looked up, she'd cry. And if she cried, the price went down. That was the rule. The man standing opposite him didn't look like the other cattlemen. They were loud, brash men who wore their wealth in silver spurs and embroidered vests. This man was a shadow. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, wearing a duster coat that had seen more winters than she had been alive. His hat was pulled low, obscuring his eyes, but she could see the scar that ran from his jawline down into his collar. This was Silas Thorne. The locals whispered that he had killed 3 men in a dispute over water rights in '82. They said he lived alone on the far ridge because even the coyotes were afraid of him. 50, Silas said. His voice was like gravel crunching under a boot heel. No emotion, no barter. 50, Vance scoffed, though the fear in his eyes was visible. Come on, Thorne. Look at her. She's got her mother's hair. Gold, pure gold. She's worth 100. Silas didn't look at her. He didn't look at her hair. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the table. The thud silenced the room. 50. Take it or I leave. Her father snatched the bag. He didn't even count it. He didn't look at her to say goodbye. He just turned to the bartender and slammed his hand on the counter. Whiskey. The good stuff. Silas turned to the girl then. For the first time, he lifted his head slightly. His eyes were not black, as the rumors said. They were a piercing, icy blue, like a frozen lake in January. There was no lust in them. There was no cruelty. There was just nothing. Let's go, he said. She grabbed her small burlap sack, everything she owned in the world, and followed him out into the blinding afternoon sun. The walk to his wagon felt like a funeral procession. She climbed onto the wooden bench seat, her hands shaking so hard she had to clasp them together in her lap. He didn't speak to her for the first 3 hours of the ride. The Wyoming landscape rolled by, vast and indifferent. Sagebrush stretched out to the horizon, broken only by jagged rock formations that looked like the teeth of the earth. Her mind was racing with terrors. She had heard stories of women sold to ranchers, slaves in everything but name, used until they broke, then discarded or buried in a shallow grave. She checked the knife she had hidden in her boot. A rusty paring knife she had stolen from the kitchen that morning. If he tries to touch me, she told herself, I will kill him, or I will kill myself. The sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange. They turned off the main trail onto a narrow, rocky path that wound up into the foothills. "Why?" she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken. Silas didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the mule's ears. "Why what? Why did you buy me?" He cracked the reins gently. "Your father owed money to Jim Coulter. Big Jim." She froze. Everyone knew Big Jim Coulter. He owned half the territory. He was a man who bought judges and sheriffs the way other men bought penny candy. "So?" she asked. "What does that have to do with you?" "Vance was going to sell you to Coulter's brothel in Cheyenne to settle the debt," Silas said flatly. "I offered him cash instead." The air left her lungs. The brothel. A fate worse than death. "So you saved me?" she asked, a tiny flicker of hope lighting in her chest. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt. They were at the top of a ridge. Below them, nestled in a valley of lush green grass and a winding creek, sat a ranch house. It was built of sturdy timber, with a wraparound porch and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It looked peaceful. He turned to look at her, and his face was hard. "Don't get romantic notions, girl. I need a housekeeper, and I need someone to watch the place when I'm out on the range. You work, you eat. You don't work, you leave. Understand?" "Yes," she breathed. "And one more thing," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You don't go into the barn after dark. Ever." She nodded, the fear creeping back in. What was in the barn? They rolled down into the valley as the stars began to bleed through the twilight. She was safe from the brothel, yes. But as she looked at the broad back of the man beside her and the scar on his neck, she realized she had just traded one cage for another, and this cage was miles from civilization, guarded by a man they called a killer. The inside of the Thorne ranch house was shocking. She expected filth, mud on the floors, animal skins rotting in the corner, the stench of unwashed men. Instead, the floorboards were swept clean. There was a rug, woven with intricate Navajo patterns, in front of the stone hearth. A bookshelf stood in the corner, filled with leather-bound volumes. Silas walked in and lit a kerosene lamp. The golden light threw long, dancing shadows against the log walls. "Kitchen is through there," he pointed. "Pantry is stocked. Make supper." He walked into the main room, took off his gun belt, and hung it on a peg by the door. Then he sat in a heavy oak chair and began to unlace his boots, ignoring her completely. She went into the kitchen. Her hands were trembling as she found a side of cured ham and some potatoes. She worked on autopilot. Peel, chop, fry. The sizzle of the fat in the cast-iron skillet was the only sound in the house. When she brought the plates out, he was reading. A book, The Count of Monte Cristo. She set the plate down. "It's ready?" He closed the book and looked at the food. "Sit." She hesitated. I can eat in the kitchen, Mr. Thorne. Name is Silas, and in this house we eat at the table. She sat. They ate in silence. The food was hot and filling, the best meal she had had in months, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. She was waiting for the moment he would wipe his mouth, stand up, and demand what he had paid $50 for. He finished his meal, pushed the plate away, and looked at her. The lamplight caught the blue of his eyes, making them burn. "You're tired," he said. "I'm fine," she lied. "Up the stairs. First door on the left. That's your room." She stood up, gripping the back of the chair. This was it. "Go on," he said, turning back to his book. She walked up the stairs, her legs feeling like lead. She reached the door he had indicated and pushed it open. It was a small room, but clean. A quilt was folded neatly on the bed. A wash basin stood on a dresser. But what caught her eye, what made her knees buckle, was the door itself. She examined the latch. It was a heavy iron slide bolt on the inside. She stared at it, breathless. If he wanted to hurt her, if he wanted to claim her as his property, why would he give her a lock that only she could control? She stepped inside and slid the bolt home. Click! The sound echoed through the silent house. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her stolen knife, listening. She heard him move downstairs. She heard the creak of his chair. She heard the front door open and close as he went out to check the horses. Then, silence. Hours passed. The moon rose high, casting a pale square of light onto the floor. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. A howl. It wasn't a coyote. It was too deep, too guttural. It sounded like a wolf, but wrong. It was followed by the frantic whinnying of the horses in the barn. She jumped up and went to the window. The barn was about 50 yards from the house. In the moonlight, she saw a shadow moving near the corral. Then she saw Silas. He had come out of the house, a Winchester rifle in his hand. He wasn't walking with the slow, heavy gait he had used earlier. He was moving with the predatory grace of a mountain lion. He raised the rifle. A flash of fire lit up the night. Crack! The shadow near the barn yelped, a human sound, not an animal one, and scrambled into the darkness. Silas didn't chase it. He stood there, statue still, watching the darkness. Then he turned and looked up at the house. He looked straight at her window. She ducked back, heart hammering against her ribs. Who was out there? And why was Silas Thorne guarding the barn as if it held the crown jewels? The next morning, she went downstairs before the sun was fully up. Silas was already gone. There was a pot of coffee on the stove, still hot, and a note written in sharp, angular handwriting. Stay close to the house. If you see dust on the road, ring the bell on the porch. Do not open the gate for anyone, especially not anyone wearing a badge. She crumpled the note in her hand. A badge? She walked out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful. But as she looked at the vast, empty horizon, she realized the isolation wasn't just geographical. Silas Thorne was hiding something. He was hiding from the law, or he was hiding from a past that was coming to collect. And now, she was an accessory. She spent the day scrubbing the floors, trying to make herself useful. Around noon, she heard the rumble of wheels. Her stomach dropped, dust on the road. She ran to the porch. A buggy was approaching, pulled by 2 sleek bays. As it got closer, she saw the man driving. He was dressed in a pristine grey suit, a stark contrast to the rugged country. He pulled up to the gate and smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, miss," he called out. His voice was smooth, like oil. "Is Mr. Thorne about?" He's out on the range," she stammered, remembering the order not to open the gate. "A shame," the man said. He climbed down and walked to the fence. "I'm worried about him. He's a man with many enemies." "Who are you?" she asked. "I'm a concerned neighbor," he said, leaning on the post. "Name's Coulter. Big Jim Coulter." The blood drained from her face. The man who owned her father's debt. The man who wanted her for his brothel. "You tell Silas I stopped by," Coulter said, his eyes raking over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "And you tell him that the deadline is approaching. He knows what I mean. If he doesn't have the deed ready by the first snow, well, accidents happen in this country." He paused, then added softly, "And you tell him that a pretty thing like you shouldn't be wasted on a broken-down killer like him. When you get tired of playing house, you come see me. I pay better." He tipped his hat, climbed back into his buggy, and rode off. She stood there, trembling. Silas hadn't bought her just to save her. He hadn't bought her just to clean his house. Coulter wanted Silas's land, and somehow she was the pawn in the middle of a war that was about to turn this quiet ranch into a graveyard. When Silas returned that evening, the sun was already bleeding out behind the mountains. He didn't ride to the barn first. He rode straight to the porch, his horse lathered and blowing hard. He had seen the buggy tracks. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his hand already resting on the ivory grip of his Colt peacemaker. He took the porch steps 2 at a time, throwing the door open with a force that made the hinges scream. She was standing by the fireplace, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, shaking. He stopped dead when he saw her. His chest was heaving, his eyes wide and wild, scanning the room for a threat that wasn't there anymore. "Did he touch you?" The question was low, guttural. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was a prelude to violence. "No," she whispered. He just talked." Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for miles. He walked over to the fireplace, pulling off his leather gloves. His movements were jerky, agitated. What did he say, Alara? Every word. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange coming from his roughened throat, like silk being dragged over sandstone. She repeated Coulter's message, the deadline, the first snow, the accidents, and the offer he made her. When she mentioned the brothel, Silas went very still. He turned away from her and stared into the dying embers of the fire. His knuckles were white where he gripped the mantelpiece. "He won't come here again," Silas said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Not while I'm breathing." He turned back to her. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the scar on his neck more prominent in the flickering firelight. He looked less like a cold-blooded killer and more like a man carrying the weight of a mountain on his shoulders. He noticed her hands. She was still gripping the coffee cup so tight her fingernails had cut into her palms, drawing tiny crescents of blood. Without a word, he walked over and gently pried the cup from her fingers. He set it on the table. Then he took her hands in his. His hands were massive, calloused and scarred, hands that knew how to mend fences and break horses and men. But his touch was startlingly light. He turned her palms up, inspecting the small cuts. He went to the kitchen and returned with a basin of water and a clean rag. He knelt before her, Silas Thorne, the terror of the territory, kneeling, and dabbed at the cuts. She stared down at the top of his head, at the dusting of grey in his dark hair. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but not from fear. It was a strange, hot sensation that spread through her chest. No man had ever touched her with anything other than roughness or demand. He finished cleaning the cuts and looked up. They were inches apart. The blue ice of his eyes had melted, revealing something agonizingly human beneath. For a second, she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with unspoken things. Then, the shutter slammed shut. He stood abruptly, dropping her hands. "Dinner in an hour," he said gruffly, turning his back on her and heading for the door. "I have work in the barn." The barn. Over the next week, a strange routine settled over the ranch. Silas was working harder than ever. He was out before dawn, reinforcing the fences, clearing brush lines of sight around the house. He was fortifying the place. And every night he spent hours in the barn. She would hear the metallic clanging of tools, the rasp of a saw. Her curiosity was becoming a physical ache. The fear of the barn had been replaced by a burning need to know what he was protecting. Coulter wanted the land, but why this specific piece of rocky, isolated land? One afternoon, Silas rode out to check the northern herd. He said he'd be gone until sundown. It was a blistering hot day. The cicadas were buzzing in the sagebrush. The ranch was dead quiet. She stood on the porch, watching his dust cloud fade. Then she looked at the barn. "Don't go in the barn after dark," he had said. It was broad daylight. She walked across the dry earth, her heart thumping a rhythm of rebellion. The heavy wooden doors were shut, secured by a simple drop latch. She lifted it. The hinges groaned, a sound that seemed louder than a gunshot in the silence. She slipped inside. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the dim light. The air smelled of hay, leather, and horse sweat. Stalls lined both sides. Silas's big roan stallion nickered at her. At first glance, it was just a barn, tack hanging on pegs, sacks of feed stacked in the corner. But then she saw the corner stall in the back. It was boarded up, floor to ceiling, with heavy planks. It looked like a holding cell for a rogue bear. She approached it carefully. There were gaps between the planks. She pressed her face against the rough wood and peered inside. It wasn't an animal. It was a workspace, a desk covered in papers, surveying equipment, and on the floor, heavy canvas sacks that looked out of place. She saw a loose board near the bottom. With a grunt of effort, she pried it back enough to squeeze through. She went to the desk. It was covered in maps of the territory. One map, much older than the others, was spread out. It showed the Thorne ranch, but it was marked with strange red symbols. She picked up a heavy rock that was sitting on top of the map. It wasn't just a rock. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for its size. One side had been chipped away, revealing a dull, yellowish gleam inside the quartz. Gold. Her breath caught. She looked at the canvas sacks on the floor. She untied one. It was filled with rocks, just like this one. Silas wasn't just ranching. He was sitting on a gold mine, a vein that must run right under this valley. "Told you never to come in here." The voice came from behind her, low and deadly. She spun around, dropping the gold ore. Silas was standing in the opening she had squeezed through. His silhouette was dark against the light from the barn door. He held his rifle loose in one hand. He stepped inside the small room. The air suddenly felt very small, very tight. "Silas, Get out!" he snarled. The gentleness from the other night was gone, replaced by the cold fury of the man she had met in the saloon. She scrambled past him, terrified. She ran out of the barn and halfway to the house before she realized he wasn't chasing her. She stood on the porch, panting, watching the barn door. He didn't come out for an hour. When he did, he wasn't carrying the rifle. He walked slowly to the house, his head down. He came inside and went straight to the whiskey bottle on the sideboard. He poured a glass and downed it in one swallow, then poured another. He turned to look at her. She was pressed against the wall by the stairs, ready to bolt to her room and slide that iron bolt home. "You think I'm greedy?" he said. His voice was thick with liquor and resignation. "You think I'm hoarding it?" "I don't know what to think," she whispered. He laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. "Coulter doesn't know about the gold, not for sure. He just suspects. He smells money like a buzzard smells death." He walked over and slumped into his chair by the fire. He looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Sit down, Elara. It's time you knew what you were sold into." She sat on the edge of the hearth, furthest from him. The fire had died down to glowing coals. Silas swirled the whiskey in his glass. "You heard the stories in town, that I killed 3 men over water rights." She nodded. "It wasn't water rights, and it wasn't my fight." He took a drink. "Before I bought this place, I worked for Coulter. For 5 years. I was his problem solver." The air in the room grew colder. The man who had gently cleaned her hands a few nights ago was confessing to being a hired killer for the monster who wanted to own her. Coulter wanted the valley north of here. The squatters wouldn't move. He sent me. Silas looked into the glass, as if he could see the ghosts of his past swimming in the amber liquid. They were good men, farmers. They just wanted to be left alone. I told Coulter I wouldn't do it. He sent others. They didn't have my scruples. He looked up at her, his eyes pleading for understanding she wasn't sure she could give. When I found out what his new men did to those families, I went hunting. I killed the 3 men Coulter sent. Left them on his doorstep as a resignation letter. "So you're hiding here?" she said, her voice trembling. "This land was my payment. Coulter let me have it because he thought it was worthless rock. It was his joke, the killer trying to play rancher." Silas gestured toward the barn. "Then I found the vein 2 years ago. If Coulter knew, he'd bring the whole U.S. Army down on this place to get it. Why didn't you take the gold and run?" "Run where? There's nowhere in this territory. Coulter's reach doesn't extend. And besides," he looked around the sturdy log cabin, "this is the first home I've ever had. I'm tired of running." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "When I saw you in that saloon, your father selling you for whiskey money. Coulter's man was at the bar. I saw him eyeing you. I knew if I didn't take you, Coulter would have you by sundown. I bought you to keep you out of his hands. That's the only reason." A complicated knot of emotions tightened in her chest. Gratitude, horror, pity, and underneath it all, that persistent, dangerous warmth. He was a bad man trying to be good, a violent man trying to build peace. "What happens when the snow comes?" she asked. Silas finished his drink and set the glass down hard. "It won't wait for snow. Coulter saw you here. He saw me refuse him. His pride is hurt. He'll move fast." He stood up and walked over to the gun rack. He pulled down a double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. He held them out to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Her father had taught her to shoot rabbits when she was 10. "Yes. Keep it in your room, loaded. If you hear shooting, you lock that door, and you don't open it unless you hear my voice. If anyone else tries to come through that door, you put both barrels in their chest. Do you understand?" She took the heavy weapon. The cold metal bit into her palms. "Yes." "Go to bed, Ilara." She didn't sleep. She lay in bed with the shotgun resting across her stomach, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the ranch felt heavy, pregnant with violence. It happened 3 nights later. There was no moon. The darkness was absolute. She was drifting in and out of a restless sleep when the sound of hoofbeats jerked her awake. Not one horse. Many. They didn't bother with stealth. They wanted terror. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. Glass shattered downstairs. Gunshots echoed, loud and sharp, tearing through the night air. She heard heavy boots on the porch. She jumped out of bed, clutching the shotgun, her heart trying to break through her ribs. She heard Silas roar something, unintelligible, from downstairs, followed by the deafening boom of his buffalo rifle. Then silence, followed by a scream, a man's scream, full of agony. "Fire!" someone shouted outside. "Burn the rat out!" A flicker of orange light danced against her window curtains. They had thrown a torch onto the porch. She couldn't stay up there. If the house caught fire, she'd be trapped. She unlocked her door and crept to the top of the stairs. The living room was illuminated by flashes of gunfire from outside and the growing orange glow of the fire on the porch. Silas was crouched by the window, firing his lever-action rifle as fast as he could cock it. He was a machine, calm and precise in the chaos. "Silas!" she hissed. He spun around, his face illuminated by a muzzle flash. A streak of blood ran down his forehead from flying glass. "Get back upstairs," he yelled. At that moment, the front door burst open with a tremendous crash. 2 men tumbled inside, guns drawn, smelling of whiskey and sweat. Silas shot the first one before he even fully stood up. The man dropped like a stone. The second man swung his revolver toward Silas. Without thinking, she raised the shotgun. She didn't aim. She just pointed it at the massive shape in the doorway and pulled both triggers. The kickback nearly dislocated her shoulder, knocking her backward onto the stairs. The roar was deafening in the enclosed space. When the smoke cleared, the doorway was empty. The second man was gone, blown backward onto the burning porch. Silas looked at her, his eyes wide with shock. For a second, the battle outside ceased to exist. Then, a bullet ripped through the open doorway and struck Silas in the left shoulder. He grunted, stumbling backward, dropping his rifle. He fell to one knee, clapping a hand over the wound. Blood dark and fast seeped between his fingers. Silas! She scrambled down the stairs, dropping the empty shotgun. He was trying to stand, his face grey with pain. "The door!" he gasped. "Close the door!" The fire on the porch was catching the doorframe. Bullets were still thudding into the logs around them. She ran to the door. The heat was intense. She grabbed the heavy oak door and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt just as a heavy weight slammed against it from the outside. They were trapped. The house was burning, and the only man who could save them was bleeding out on the floor. The heat was already rising, curling the wallpaper and filling the cabin with the acrid taste of burning pine. The front door groaned under the assault of the men outside, the wood splintering with every kick. Silas was a heavyweight against her. His face was pale, slick with sweat, his teeth gritted in a rictus of pain. The bullet had taken the fight out of his body, but not his eyes. They were still sharp, assessing, calculating. "Kitchen!" he rasped, his voice a wet gurgle. "Back door!" She hooked her arms under his good shoulder, her boots slipping on the blood-slicked floor. "Come on!" she grunted, heaving him up. They stumbled through the kitchen. The house was a darker shade of hell now. Smoke rolled along the ceiling like a thunderhead. Silas pointed a shaking hand toward the pantry. "Trapdoor, under the rug." She froze. "A cellar?" "No," he coughed. "Tunnel. Leads to the barn." She dragged the heavy woven rug aside. Beneath it was a rough-hewn wooden square. She yanked the iron ring, and the door swung open, revealing a black maw of earth and a ladder descending into darkness. "Go!" Silas wheezed. He tried to push her toward it, but he stumbled, falling to his knees. "I'll hold them off here." "Don't be stupid," she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. "You can't hold a gun. Get down there." The front door gave way with a crash that shook the foundations. Men were shouting, their voices triumphant. "Get the girl! Kill the cripple!" Fear, cold and sharp, washed over her. She grabbed Silas by his vest and practically shoved him into the hole. He groaned, tumbling down the first few rungs before catching himself. She followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above them, just as heavy boots thundered into the kitchen. She locked the latch from the inside. Dust rained down on her face as footsteps stomped directly overhead. "Where are they?" a voice roared. It was Coulter. "Check the back." They were in a narrow, suffocating earthen tunnel. It smelled of damp soil and roots. It was barely 4 feet high. They had to crawl. Silas was moving slow, dragging his left leg. She could hear his labored breathing echoing in the tight space. She crawled behind him, pushing at his boots, urging him on. "Keep going, Silas, please." "Leave me," he muttered, his voice echoing weirdly in the dirt. "Save yourself." "I am saving myself," she hissed. "You're the only one who knows how to kill them." It felt like miles, though it must have been only 50 yards. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a wider space, the hidden room in the barn. Silas collapsed onto the floor as they emerged into the dim light of the lantern he had left burning earlier. He rolled onto his back, clutching his shoulder. The blood had soaked through his coat, turning the heavy fabric black. She scrambled up and shoved the crate of dynamite over the tunnel opening, blocking it. If they found the trap door in the house, it would take them time to move the heavy weight. She turned to Silas. He was fading. His eyes were fluttering shut. "Silas!" She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over the wound. She didn't know what to do. She was a rancher's daughter, not a surgeon. He opened his eyes. They were hazy. "Whiskey," he whispered. "Top shelf." She found the bottle on the desk. She uncorked it and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, coughing as the liquid hit his throat. Then he poured the rest of it directly onto his shoulder. He screamed. It was a raw, animal sound that made her flinch. His body arched off the floor, muscles seizing. "Knife!" he gasped when the spasm passed. "Get the bullet out!" She stared at him. "I can't. I'll kill you. I'm dead if you don't." He reached out with his good hand and gripped her wrist. His skin was burning hot, but his grip was iron. "Do it, Ilara. You have the fire in you. I saw it when you pulled that trigger. Use it." She looked at the knife on his belt. A heavy Bowie knife. She pulled it free. The blade was sharp enough to shave with. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the horror of what she had to do. She cut away his shirt, revealing the mangled flesh of his shoulder. The bullet was lodged deep, near the collarbone. "Do it," he commanded. She dug the tip of the knife into the wound. Silas didn't scream this time. He bit down on his leather belt, a low moan escaping his throat. Blood welled up, hot and sticky on her fingers. She could feel the metal of the bullet against the knife tip. She leveraged it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Pop! The lead slug fell onto the wooden floor with a tiny clink. Silas went limp, passing out from the pain. She grabbed a clean rag from the desk and pressed it hard against the wound, leaning her entire weight into it to staunch the bleeding. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and angry. "Don't you die," she whispered fiercely. "You bought me for $50, Silas Thorne. You don't get to leave me now." She sat there for hours, listening to the sounds of destruction outside. The house was fully ablaze now. She could hear the roar of the fire and the collapse of timbers. Coulter's men were shouting, searching the grounds. They knew they hadn't run past them. They knew they had to be close, and eventually they turned their eyes to the barn. The first shot hit the barn door, just as the sun began to grey the eastern sky. The wood splintered, a beam of dusty light cutting through the gloom. Silas stirred. He blinked, confusion clouding his features before memory slammed back into him. He tried to sit up, groaning. "Stay down," she said, pushing him back gently. "You're weak." "They're here," he rasped. "They've been here all night. They burned the house to the ground, Silas. It's gone, everything." He looked at her, and a strange shadow passed over his face. Not anger, regret. "My books," he said softly. "I didn't finish the book." It was such a mundane, human thing to say in the face of death that she almost laughed. "Thorne," the voice boomed from outside. "Big Jim Coulter. I know you're in there, Silas, and I know you've got the girl. Make this easy. Come out, sign the deed. I'll let you ride away." Silas managed to sit up, leaning heavily against the desk. He checked his revolver. "He's lying," he said. "He leaves no loose ends." "What do we do?" she asked. The terror was back, vibrating in her bones. They were trapped in a wooden box, and they had torches. Silas looked at the canvas sacks of gold ore stacked in the corner. Then he looked at the crate of dynamite she had used to block the tunnel. "We give him what he wants," Silas said. But his eyes were hard, the blue ice returning. He struggled to his feet, swaying. She rushed to support him, wrapping her arm around his waist. He leaned into her, his breath hot on her neck. "Elara," he said, his voice low. "There's a back way out of the barn, the horse stall, the loose board you found. I know it. When the shooting starts, and it will start, you go. You run for the creek bed. Follow it north. There's a settlement about 20 miles up." "No," she said instantly. He looked at her, surprised. "I'm not leaving you," she said. "You can barely walk. You'll die in here alone." "I'm dying anyway, girl. This wound—" He touched his bandage. "It's bad. I can feel the fever starting." "Then we die together," she said. "I'm not going back to Coulter. I'd rather burn." Silas stared at her for a long moment. He reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, calloused, but the touch was so tender it made her breath catch. "I never wanted this for you," he whispered. "I thought I could give you a quiet life, a safe life." "You gave me a choice," she said. "That's more than anyone else ever gave me." "Thorne, I'm losing patience," Coulter yelled. A bullet punched through the wall, shattering a lantern glass. Silas pulled his hand away and straightened up. The pain seemed to recede, replaced by a cold, deadly resolve. He limped over to the crate of dynamite. He took 3 sticks and bundled them together, jamming a fuse into the center. "Open the main doors," he said. "What?" "Open them. Wide." She looked at him like he was crazy, but she obeyed. She ran to the heavy doors and through the latch. She pushed them open. The morning light flooded in, blindingly bright. 50 yards away, Coulter sat on his horse, flanked by 6 men. They all had rifles trained on the dark opening of the barn. Behind them, the smouldering ruins of the ranch house sent a plume of black smoke into the clear sky. "Smart move, Silas," Coulter called out, trotting his horse forward a few paces. "Come on out, hands high." Silas stepped into the doorway. He was leaning on a shovel like a cane, his left arm bound in a bloody sling. He looked broken, defeated. "You win, Jim," Silas called out. His voice was weak, carrying on the wind. "I'm done fighting." Coulter laughed. It was a rich, booming sound. "See, boys, every dog knows when he's beat." Coulter rode closer, emboldened. He stopped 10 yards from the barn door. "Where's the girl? Send her out first." "She's inside," Silas said. "She's hurt." Coulter's smile faltered. "Damaged goods? That's a shame. Still, she'll fetch a price." He dismounted, signaling his men to lower their weapons slightly. "All right, Silas, hand over the deed. And tell me, where is it?" "The gold. I know you found it." Silas didn't move. He stood in the shadow of the doorframe. "It's right here," Silas said. He kicked the shovel away. He wasn't leaning on it for support. He was standing tall, fueled by adrenaline and hate. In his good hand, he held the bundle of dynamite. He struck a match against the doorframe and lit the fuse. Coulter's eyes went wide. "Silas, no!" "You want the gold, Jim?" Silas roared, his voice suddenly thunderous. "Come and get it!" He hurled the dynamite, not at the men. He threw it straight up, into the loft of the barn. "Run!" Silas grabbed her hand and yanked her backward, deeper into the barn, toward the fortified room in the back. "He's crazy!" Coulter screamed. "Get back!" The explosion was earth-shattering. The roof of the barn, packed with dry hay and dust, didn't just catch fire. It detonated. The blast wave knocked Coulter's men from their horses. Timbers rained down like meteors. Inside the reinforced room, dust poured from the ceiling, but the heavy oak beams held. "The tunnel!" Silas shouted. "Now!" He didn't wait for her to clear the crate. He shoved it aside with a strength he shouldn't have possessed. He pushed her into the hole and scrambled in after her. Above them, The barn was collapsing. They crawled through the dark earth as the world above disintegrated. The roar of the fire was muffled, a dull rumble that shook the ground around them. They reached the trap door under the ruins of the kitchen. It was jammed by debris. "We're stuck," she cried, pushing against the wood. It wouldn't budge. "Back," Silas said. "Back to the barn entrance." "We can't. It's an inferno." "Not the room," Silas panted. "The mine shaft." She froze. "What?" "The reinforced room. It sits on top of the old ventilation shaft for the mine. There's a winch. We can go down." They crawled back. The air in the reinforced room was getting hot, smoke seeping through the cracks in the planks. The barn overhead was a raging bonfire. Silas went to the corner of the room, throwing aside the canvas sacks of gold. Beneath them was a heavy iron grate. He unlocked it with a key from his belt. "It's deep," he said. "And it's dark." "Better than burning," she said. He hooked the winch cable to his belt and wrapped his arm around her. "Hold on. Tight." He kicked the brake release. They dropped into the abyss just as the roof of the reinforced room gave way, burying the entrance in flaming debris. They fell into the cool, damp darkness of the earth, leaving the fire and Coulter far above. They were alive, but they were trapped underground, wounded, with no way out, but down. The darkness of the mine was heavy, a physical weight pressing against their chests. The air was thin, smelling of stagnant water and ancient dust. The only sound was the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water, echoing from some unseen chamber, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the man beside her. Silas had collapsed 10 minutes after they hit the bottom of the shaft. The adrenaline that had allowed him to throw the dynamite was gone, leaving only the fever and the blood loss. She ripped the hem of her petticoat, her once white dress now grey with soot and stained with blood, and dipped it into a puddle of groundwater. She wiped his forehead. He was burning up. "Leave me," he mumbled, delirious. "Coulter, he'll be waiting at the drift mouth." "I'm not leaving you, Silas," she said, her voice echoing in the tunnel. "You stood between me and hell. Now I'm standing between you and death. That's the deal." She pulled his arm over her shoulder again. "Up. Now." They stumbled through the blackness for what felt like hours. The mine was old, the support beams rotting. Every time Silas scuffed his boot against a timber, dirt rained down, threatening to bury them alive. Finally, she saw it. A faint, grey light ahead. The drift mouth. It opened out near the creek bed, hidden by a thicket of willows. They reached the opening. She pushed aside the overgrown brush and gasped. The fresh air hit her lungs like cold water. They were out. But they weren't safe. About 50 yards away, sitting on a flat rock by the creek, smoking a cigar, was Big Jim Coulter. He was alone. His men must have been up at the ruins of the house, digging for bodies. But Coulter, he was a predator. He knew exactly where a fox would run when its den was smoking. He saw the movement in the willows. He didn't draw his gun immediately. He just smiled, a cruel twisting of his lips. "I knew it," Coulter called out. "I knew Silas Thorne was too mean to die in a fire." Silas tried to reach for his gun, but his hand flopped uselessly at his side. He sank to his knees in the mud. She stood in front of him. She was 18 years old. She was dirty, exhausted, and terrified. But she was done being sold. She was done being owned. Coulter stood up, brushing ash from his suit. He walked toward them, his hand resting casually on his pearl-handled revolver. "Step aside, girl," Coulter said. "You've caused me enough trouble. I'll take the deed from his pocket, and then maybe I'll let you live. If you're nice." "He doesn't have the deed," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. Coulter stopped. "What?" "The deed," she said. "He didn't have it. It was in the house, in the firebox. It's ash now." Coulter's face turned purple. "You lie." "And the gold?" She pointed back toward the mine entrance. "The explosion collapsed the main shaft. The vein is buried under 1,000 tons of rock. It'll take you years to dig it out. And by then, everyone in the territory will know what you did here." Coulter stared at the mine entrance, then back at her. The greed in his eyes fought with the realization of his loss. He had burned down the prize he wanted to steal. "Well then," Coulter snarled, drawing his gun, "I guess I'll just take the satisfaction of killing you both." He raised the pistol. Click. The sound of a hammer being cocked came from the ridge above them. "Drop it, Jim." The voice was cold, hard, and familiar to anyone who lived in Wyoming. Coulter froze. He looked up. Sitting on a horse on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun, was a man with a silver star on his chest, and flanked behind him were 3 U.S. Marshals. "Sheriff Canton," Coulter said, his voice trembling slightly. Frank Canton, a real name in these parts, a man who walked the line between the law and the gunman, but who had no patience for sloppy butchers. "We saw the smoke from 10 miles out," Canton said, riding slowly down the embankment. "And we found 3 of your boys trying to loot a dead body up at the house. They talk fast when they're staring at a noose, Jim." Coulter lowered his gun slowly. "Sheriff, this man is a squatter. He attacked me. I was defending my—" "Save it for the judge in Cheyenne," Canton spat. "You burned a man's house down. You used dynamite. That's not a land dispute, Coulter. That's war, and the governor doesn't like war in his territory." The deputies swarmed Coulter, wresting the gun from his hand and cuffing him. He screamed threats, promising he'd buy his way out, promising he'd own them all. But they dragged him away towards the horses. Canton rode over to where she was kneeling in the mud, holding Silas up. The sheriff looked down at them. He looked at the blood on her dress, the knife in Silas's belt, and the fierce look in her eyes. "He alive?" Canton asked. "Barely," she said. "Get him to the wagon," Canton ordered his men. "Doc's in town." He tipped his hat to her. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of respect. The recovery was long. The bullet had chipped the bone, and the infection nearly took Silas 3 times. For a month, he lay in a fever dream in a boarding house in Laramie. She didn't leave his side. She washed sheets. She cooked broths. She paid the doctor with the last of the money Silas had in his saddlebags. When the fever finally broke, it was the dead of winter. Snow was piled 4 feet high against the window. Silas opened his eyes. They were clear. The blue ice was gone, replaced by the calm of a quiet sea. He looked at her sitting in the chair, reading the end of the Count of Monte Cristo to him. "You stayed," he rasped. "I told you," she said, closing the book. "I don't break deals." He tried to sit up, wincing. "The ranch?" "Gone," she said. "The land is there, but the gold is buried. And Coulter is awaiting trial. They say Judge Parker might even come up for it. They're calling it the Red Hollow Massacre." Silas lay back against the pillows. He looked at the ceiling, then at his hand, the hand that had killed men, the hand that had signed for her, the hand that had held hers in the dark. "I have nothing left, Ilara," he said softly. "The gold was my retirement. The ranch was my home. I'm a cripple with a past and empty pockets. You're free. You can go. Find a young man. A rich man." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the white, clean world. "My father sold me for $50, she said quietly. "He put a price on my life. You paid it. But you didn't buy a slave, Silas. You bought a partner." She turned back to him. "We don't need the gold. We have the land. We have the cattle that survived. We can rebuild. Not as a fortress, as a home. Silas looked at her for a long time. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of that first night. It was a comfortable silence, a silence built on trust. "It'll be hard work," he said. "I've never been afraid of work," she replied, "only of being powerless. And you—" She walked over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his scars. "You made sure I'll never be powerless again." He squeezed her hand. A small smile, rare and genuine, touched his lips. "At 18, he whispered, "I thought you were a child. I was wrong. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. We did rebuild. We didn't dig for the gold. We left it in the earth where it belonged, a secret buried with the ghosts of the past. We raised horses. We raised a family. And every night, before he locked the door, Silas would check the bolt. Not to keep her in, but to keep the world out. People still talk about the burning of the Thorne ranch. They talk about the gunfight. But they don't know the real story. They don't know that the greatest treasure wasn't in the mine. It was in the moment a broken killer and a souled girl decided that love wasn't about ownership. It was about survival. Together. And that is the story of Elara and Silas. History books might mention the range wars and the men like Big Jim Coulter who tried to pave the West with greed, but they rarely mention the quiet victories of people like Silas and Elara. They proved that even in a world where everything has a price tag, even a human life, loyalty is the one thing that can't be bought. It has to be earned. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, or if Silas and Elara's journey touched you, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these lost legends to life. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you found a gold mine but knew it would bring a war to your doorstep, would you keep it, or would you bury it like Silas did? Let me know down below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a story from the frontier. We have a dark mystery from the muddy streets of 1890s London coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.